Professor Ecaterina Locoman, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. Moldova's parliamentary elections delivered a decisive victory for ruling pro-European Union PAS despite unprecedented Russian interference. Should we interpret this outcome as a durable consolidation of democratic resilience or as a contingent success heavily dependent on extraordinary EU and Western support?
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think that we can interpret the results of the Moldovan elections as a hybrid outcome, right? So it's a demonstrated domestic effort in which, you could see the effort of the domestic political institutions, of the voters, and the resilience that they had in front of the Russian interference and influence in Moldova. But at the same time, it's true that without the support of the Western partners that Moldova has, especially the European Union, this success would have not been possible, right? So it's a hybrid, again, outcome. It's a hybrid influence, but at the same time, I think that the fact that back in 2024 during the presidential elections and now in 2025 during the parliamentary elections, we kind of have the same stream, the same direction that voters selected is a sign that democracy may not be as strong as stable as one would want to be, right? But it is a process, and it is the Moldovans are basically working, the institutions, the domestic political institutions are working every day to kind of strengthen it, right? So we saw that there was a high degree of voter mobilization, right? So despite the high efforts of Russian interference, disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, and illicit financing, the voter turnout was more or less high, right? 52%. And so this shows like a high level of civic engagement from the population. There was also, compared to the presidential elections in 2024, I think the domestic institutions, the prosecutor's office and the police were much more, they learned from the past mistakes, basically, and they were much more able to identify actors who were unlawfully using illicit funding or were engaged in illicit electoral acts. And so this kind of strengthened the voters' confidence in the electoral process. And of course, as in previous elections in Moldova, diaspora engagement was very strong as well this time. And so I think that we can talk about an increased resilience among Moldovans.
All right. To what extent do the results reflect a deepening societal commitment to a pro-European orientation, as opposed to a rejection of entrenched pro-Russian elites such as Igor Dodon and his allies, whose populist appeals often fuse anti-elite rhetoric with civilizational tropes about Russia as Moldova's natural ally?
So yeah, that's a very good question. So I think, the results show that, again, the election results, as well as the one in 2024, the one in 2021, they still, it's a trend, I think, that shows that the society as a whole is more or less committed to a pro-Western orientation, right? So we see that there is a strong, and I travel to Moldova on a yearly basis, and I can see that the country has changed very much in the last years since Maia Sandu became the president of the country, right? So there is a very clear trend, and yet it's true, it's not clear how many people from Moldova live abroad, but every summer they come back, and maybe, my impression of the country is being skewed because I come in the summer when a lot of the diaspora members come home, but like the spirit in the country is very much pro-European. But it's also true that, there were reports, right? So I studied the way in which both Russia and the West try to influence domestic politics in the post-Soviet states. And in my findings, what I found was that, Russia has long been grooming local political actors, both in countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia. So the fact that they were able to kind of educate, or how should I put it, attract specific kinds of political actors who, like Igor Dodon, for example, he was a former president of Moldova, but right now he is not benefiting from much popularity among a large swath of Moldovan electorate, right? So this is a sign that Moldovans are kind of able to distinguish between actors who really want to provide a future for the country, who are indeed involved and devoted to promoting democracy, rule of law, safety, economic development to the people, versus actors who, I would say, the pro-Russia actors, yes, they basically promote some kind of, they were not as original or as creative in the ways in which they were kind of promoting this pro-Russia view, right? So this pro-Russia message is losing also because of the war in Ukraine, and it's not kind of easy to sell this message anymore. To kind of, before it used to be this idea about, we are strategic in our choices, we move Russia, pro-Russia or pro-West, depending on which country best satisfies the needs that Moldovan people or Moldovan politicians have. Right now, it's a little bit harder to do that, simply because of the war that's raging in neighboring Ukraine, and people are aware of that. And Moldova received a huge number of refugees from Ukraine. And so, it basically much more harder, I think, for the pro-Russia parties right now to kind of sell the pro-Russia ticket as good as it was before.
Right. With turnout just above 50%, what does this relative disengagement reveal about the durability of past mandate, and thus persistent electoral apathy risk undermining the legitimacy of Moldova's democratic consolidation over time?
So as I was saying a little bit earlier, I think that yes, the turnout was just over 50%, but this number is not unusually low for Moldova. And in fact, compared to some recent elections in the region, 52% is relatively solid, I would say. But you are right that the number also signals that significant portion of the electorate remains disengaged, which has implications for the durability of the ruling party right now, and in its mandate to govern for the next 4 years, right? So the fact that the party of Maya Sandu won re-elections, like the second time, it's clear that they secured, it's really important, they secured the real clear majority of seats, resisted the heavy Russian interference and influence. But at the same time, their enthusiasm rests very much during elections, when it's this choice, are we moving east or are we moving west, right? So sometimes this enthusiasm doesn't last throughout the entire governing period of 4 years. And again, Moldovans are frustrated to some of the pace of the reforms, the fact that corruption is still present, that the pace of judicial change is not as fast as some hoped for it to be, right? So again, many domestic voters remain frustrated with this slow reforms and poverty and day-to-day economic hardships, so that it is doubly important for the governing party right now to deliver quickly, right? So to maintain this goal of joining the European Union, as they said, as well as doing their homework at home and making sure that whatever they are doing satisfies the electorate. Because it looks like, if you look at, and I think it's really, the Russian presence is acting as a a blessing in disguise, if one could argue in this regard, right? So if there was not Russia and the Russian threat at the border, maybe Moldovan political parties would have been lazier in the sense of like more reluctant to engage in reforms. But because the Russian threat is so much closer to the border, then this poses so much more anxiety to local domestic political actors and the population to kind of mobilize and choose the European Union. And I think what changed very much from previous elections, right? So in the last 10 years, since 2010, let's say, is the significant impact that the European Union suffered to the Moldovan president Maia Sandu and to the political parties. The fact that, you know, we had so much symbolic support from EU leaders coming to Moldova, visiting, symbolic, also technical, financial support. This is unprecedented in Moldovan history, right? In fact, my own research looked at how since 1991, when Moldova declared its independence from the USSR, one of the main issues that it faced in its foreign policy was making sure that the West had Moldova on the radar at all, right? So Moldova was there only because of the Transnistrian conflict, only because, you know, people just, as long as it was safe and it was quiet, they were happy. But right now, you know, the Moldovan political elites, I think, you know, especially Maia Sandu, they really managed to kind of break this wall and convince the European leaders that Moldova is strategically important to the EU, to the safety of the EU. So yeah.
Yeah. The diaspora played a decisive role in shaping the outcome. How should we understand this transnationalization of Moldovan democracy, especially given populist narratives at home that cast the diaspora as an illegitimate, externalized electorate undermining national sovereignty?
So that's true. I like this expression that you had, the transnationalization of Moldovan democracy. So I think the numbers show that about 300,000, 280 to be exact, 280,000 Moldovans abroad voted in the elections. And I think this is because one, the governing party saw that a lot of their support comes from the diaspora, right? So this they facilitated the way in which Moldovans vote abroad. The institution of the mail ballots, I think, was really smart and very strategic, because, you know, people who you know, live in countries like the United States, for example, it's much more easier to vote by mail than to go in person to the Moldovan embassy or the consulates to vote. So I think that was important. The fact that domestic, again, political elites kind of understood the role that diaspora play. I think another role is the fact that the diaspora is relatively young, right? Most of the people who traveled abroad are in their 50s, 40s, 30s, young people, right? 20s. And so they still hold very strong links to the Moldovan political, to what is going on at home, basically, right? Many of them have families at home, so they are very much engaged in this. And I was also very happy to see how much, you know, this civic engagement from the diaspora, how much they were trying to kind of get involved and promote the European integration. I think, you know, yes, it's true that, you know, the more pro-Russia parties declare the diaspora as being like, I think it was Igor Dodon who at one point in the previous presidential elections kind of called the diaspora like an parallel electorate, that they do not know what's going on at home, that they live in the West, therefore they want the country to join the West, and that people who live, they are basically broken from what's going on at home, which I think is not true, because, as I said, the links are very strong between the diaspora and what's going on at home. If you go in the summertime, you see that a lot of the young people, young families, so like in the 1990s, for example, or early 2000s, a lot of Moldovans, because we did not have visa free regime with the EU, a lot of people were unfortunately trying to go to the EU and work. illegally, right? So they would just be stuck there. They wouldn't be able to come back home. They would just be sending money, remittances. That was the maximum support that they were able to offer. Now, because the European Union offered visa-free regime, and a lot of people in Moldova were also able to get Romanian citizenship because Romania changed its citizenship law. And as long as Moldovans showed that in the interwar period when Moldova was still part of big Romania, our grandparents were living there and we kind of had links to Romania. A lot of people were able to get this Romanian passports. And so with that, a lot of people were able to go and work in the EU. So what happens is that many young families, they may live in European countries like Germany, Belgium, Great Britain. They may live in the West during the year, but then they build homes in Moldova. They have parents, they have siblings who are, they are still keeping in touch. So I do not think that it is appropriate to kind of argue that the diaspora is not linked to what's going on. It's in fact very much part of what's going on at home. So I think that as long as domestic political actors are able to engage the diaspora to continue these links, hopefully the pro-European movement kind of keeps being strong.
Right. Observers describe Moldova as a laboratory for Russia's hybrid interference. From disinformation to illicit financing, what does the 2025 electoral cycle reveal about the adaptive limits of Moscow's toolkit of influence?
So I think that, yes, we've seen new models of influence that Russia has used in the elections, right? So the use of AI, the use of alternative financial ways, right? So like the cryptocurrency, for example, is new because they wanted to, in order to kind of hide the link, the financial tools, they kind of tried to use cryptocurrency, so that in a way influenced this. But I think again it kind of showed what the limits of the Russian influence are. I would like to also say that I would kind of have a caveat here. The Moscow is one of the best, the Kremlin is one of the best students of the post-Soviet region, right? They know the region very well. They have people who studied very well. So I assume that I expect that they will learn from their own mistakes and improve in the next elections. So it means that it's not, it's kind of like the fact that now we, in Moldova, the pro-European party won. It shouldn't be a sign that we kind of can stay, can become lazy in a way, right? Self-sufficient in a way. This fight needs to continue, right? Again, as I said, Moscow is a very good student of the post-Soviet region, and what they know the best to do is they know the internal realities in these countries. They know the challenges that people face, the domestic weak points. So then they try to use this to the advantage of their messages and narratives that they are using to kind of promote, right? So. But at the same time, as I was saying earlier, all of these tools proved maybe ineffective in this point in time because Moldovan institutions proved to be, and civil society as well, were more proactive than in past elections, right? Again, I think the Moldovan institutions learned a lesson from last presidential elections, right? So parties that engaged in illicit financing were excluded from the ballot. Prosecutions were pursued, and the government was much more transparent in communicating about this disinformation campaigns, right? So again, people were much more aware of what was going on. So again, I think that while the Russian toolkit evolved technologically, its effectiveness is limited when met with resilient institutions, rapid countermeasures, and credible alternatives, right? So I think that, if we look at, I think one success formula that worked in Moldova at this point in time, again, I would be very cautious and I would kind of be careful to kind of say that this is it, this is the end. I think, Russian influence and interference will remain strong in the region, but one success formula that worked was a credible message, a credible pro-EU message from the local domestic political parties, a credible support from the EU, which was very important, right? This was coupled. And the fact that, again, this pro-Russia parties that were prominent, they were not as original in their messaging. And again, the fact that there is a war raging in neighboring Ukraine kind of supported the pro-EU camp.
Right. In the light of your research on Russian influence strategies, how do you interpret Moscow's reliance on populist-style appeals, framing EU integration as a betrayal of sovereignty, invoking fears of war, or portraying elites as foreign agents? Does the Moldovan case suggest a recalibration of these tactics compared to Ukraine and Georgia?
Yeah, so I think that, what is happening in Moldova, again, kind of linking to what I was just saying in my previous question, when I think about Georgia, I think that, in Georgia, the support for the pro-EU orientation was very strong. Public opinion support was extremely strong, but it was not enough, right? Domestic political elites, when Russia was able to find a credible, strong domestic political actor, then, they were able to promote this their own interests inside Georgia, right? So I think that what is different in Moldova's case right now, what worked well was that there was a credible pro-EU party as well as strong political, a strong public opinion support for the European Union. Now, again, as I was saying, Russia does not necessarily rely on populist style appeals. They know, again, they know what the weaknesses in each of these countries are. They know the weak links, and so they try to use those links for their own interests, right? But one thing that I noticed is that as long as domestic political elites are smart and strategic in the ways in which they form their own political messaging, matters a lot, right? So I will give an example. In Moldova, for the time since, we declared independence in 1991, one very big question was, is the language that Moldovans speak in Moldova Romanian or Moldovan, right? So that was a very big political campaigns, electoral campaigns are kind of built on this division. And oftentimes, more pro-EU, pro-Romanian parties would say that we speak Romanian. The more pro-Russia parties were saying that we speak Moldovan. And every electoral campaign, this pro-Russia political parties were using these narratives to kind of disengage voters from real problems, right? From economic corruption. But what happened in a few years since Maia Sandu came to power and became the Moldovan president, what happened was that the fact that the language we speak in Moldova is called Romanian was enshrined in the Moldovan constitution. So there was no question about it. Nobody is debating about it now, right? So the thing that I want to say is that as long as domestic political elites manage to kind of settle down some of these debates that are not important to the everyday life of Moldovans, because nobody lives better economically, or their level of income doesn't increase if they agree or disagree on this, right? So I think that, again, when the Russians spot some kind of this differences, then they manipulate public opinion and they can win. But as long as domestic political elites can agree and establish that, white is white and black is black, then it's much harder for pro-Russia political actors then to come and influence, right? So, for example, oftentimes, the pro-Russia parties have a big backing in the Orthodox Church in Moldova, which is very strong. And so some priests, there were reports, were used by the Kremlin to kind of influence public opinion. But again, as long as there is a clear messaging from the mainstream political parties in Moldova that they are not anti-religion, that, you know, religion is actually respected and people are free to, there is no war, right? So it's not like, because it's basically oftentimes based on fake realities and people who they can discern the truth from the lie. So it's much more easier than for the people who live there and who understand, who have a credible, again, messaging from the local political elites. It's easy to kind of discern the truth versus the lie. So this is how I would say it in a quick. And again, this relative narrative about the war, it's much more harder for Russia to sell it right now. Again, why? Because they're waging a war in neighboring Ukraine, right? So it's much more harder to kind of say that, oh, if we move towards the EU, then a war is coming. This was, again, very much true in earlier elections, but right now when it is clear that, you know, the West, as long as the West, again, supports what's going on in Ukraine, and as long as Ukraine kind of withstands this Russian attack, then it will be much more easier for Moldova to also stay strong and maintain this pro-European orientation and stance.
Right. How sustainable is Moldova's reliance on Western partners for countering hybrid threats, given persistent vulnerabilities such as corruption, weak institutions, and economic hardships?
This is a very good question. I think about it very often, right? So, unfortunately, again, as I said, as much as Russian influence is a maybe blessing in disguise, in the sense that it mobilizes people at home to be hardworking, to you know, political parties, if you campaigned on a promise, you need to kind of deliver those promises and be quick in your actions. You know, the EU support, the support from the European Union, even the support from the United States, you know, it's the best thing that can happen to Moldova. So unfortunately, what I can say that is, you know, as long as the EU will be invested in Moldova, we will be able to maintain our pro-European path much easier. One fear that I have is that, you know, we kind of will become complacent in our own situation, and we will know that, oh, the EU or the West will always come to our rescue. We just need to do whatever we are doing inside, right? So again, going to Moldova, oftentimes, you know, I hear some of the people, business people, entrepreneurs complaining that not much has changed since 10, 15 years ago, right? It's still, corruption is rampant. In order to obtain some permits to build something, you also need to pay somebody in the government, right? So this is unfortunate, and people understand all of that. So my conclusion is that as long as this domestic political parties understand that is break it or make it, if they do not deliver on the promises that they made, it's going to be much more easier for the Russian political forces for the political actors in Moldova who are promoting Russian interests to kind of regain power. And I think once that's done, it will be much more harder to get Moldova out of the Russian embrace. So I think it very much depends on the willingness of the ruling party right now in Maya Sandu to kind of deliver on the reforms that they promised they would.
Right. Do Moldova's elections signal a broader decline in Russia's ability to project influence across the post-Soviet space, or should Moscow's defeat here be read as tactical rather than strategic?
So as I shared earlier, I do not think that this is a Russian defeat for like the long term, right? Again, Russia is very smart in adjusting its messaging and its tactics with respect not only to the post-Soviet region, but to the wider EU region as well. So I think that, you know, they will learn from their mistakes, and they will continue to influence domestic politics in Moldova as much as we don't like it. Even if maybe, you know, their political actors that they supported did not win as many seats in parliament as they initially hoped, we can look at the first 4 years that Maya Sandu's party was governing, right? Basically, this previous 4 years were devoted to crisis management. Yes, it's true. Initially, it was the COVID pandemic, but then the war in Ukraine, which was caused by Russia in Ukraine, threw everything upside down in Moldova. So instead of focusing on judicial reforms and economic development, as the party initially said it would, and as Maya Sandu said, they had to kind of, and I think they managed. They were successful at delivering some of the some of the promises that they had in the electoral campaign, but it was 10 times harder, right? So I expect that Russia will continue to influence domestic politics. They will not. It's part of their strategic goal to kind of regain control over the post-Soviet region. And so I don't think that this should be read as a strategic loss. It's more of a temporary loss, but they will, again, gather their sources. And so that therefore, both the Moldovans and the European Union leaders need to stay on their toes, basically awake, being careful of what the next steps might be so that they are prepared to counteract those measures.
Right. And lastly, Professor Locoman, President Sandu has tied her mandate to enshrining an irreversible European path. How realistic is Moldova's aim to achieve EU accession by 2030, given the scale of domestic reforms required and potential geopolitical vetoes within the Union?
Yes, so recently Maya Sandu visited Copenhagen, right? I think Denmark, they had the big summit with the big EU leaders, right? So Ukraine was there and Maya Sandu was there. And I think there were reports that they were hoping Hungary would be persuaded not to veto the right of Ukraine and Moldova to start accession negotiations, although I think Hungary was not persuaded, right? So the only hope I think that they have right now is that there will be a political change in Hungary, in Budapest, so that, this can be changed. I think a lot of the frustration from what I hear, again, among the policymakers in Moldova, when it comes to EU, they are frustrated that the European Union decided to put Moldova and Ukraine in the same bucket when it comes to European integration. There were hopes that, that we would be decoupled in a way, that Moldova will go its own way and Ukraine would go its own way. The Europeans are still, I think, on the side that, that we should go together as a group. But I think that a fear that I have is if at least, Moldova is much smaller than Ukraine. And so, yes, domestic reforms need to be done, but, as long as there is political will, I think it is possible to achieve them. I kind of share a little bit of the concern that you have in the question. I am afraid that, if the situation continues to be as it is right now, Moldova might resemble the same fate as the one of Western Balkans in the past 20 years, since they, were also, the door was opened for them, but then they kind of stalled and no progress has been made apart from, Croatia to join the EU, right? So that is, I have a little bit of a, not fear, but some, doubts about how quickly the situation can move by 2030. Is it this realistic? But then again, up until 2022, Moldova did not even, it was knocking again for 30 years, for more than 30 years, it was knocking on EU's doors to be given candidate status. And the EU kept saying no, no, and no. And then in the end, it did. Yes, it was because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it was unfortunate that it was because of that, but it happened. So, I try to stay optimistic and hope that this would be possible, but by 2030, Moldova would join the EU.
Professor Ecaterina Locoman, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it too.